So what is Oldhammer in the Warhammer community, and why Games Workshop does not support Oldhammer? And I agree, they don't want to support it because there's no money in Oldhammer except for a very, very limited sliver of a section where occasionally a couple of times a year they crank up the presses and print out some miniatures. So essentially Oldhammer is not using old miniatures in your Warhammer armies or your Age of Sigmar armies, although Games Workshop does actively discourage that. And we explored a vlog from yesterday where if I read their tournament rules and their store rules, you have to use current 40K models. So what that means for me, being a Grey Knights player, half of my army is just off the table because I have the metal sculpts for my Grey Knights. I have Land Raiders, I have vehicles, I have some modern plastics, but the bulk of the army is the old school plastics, and they look fantastic. Games Workshop says I can't play them. So Oldhammer is not necessarily using old models in your current army. Oldhammer is playing old systems of Games Workshop, realizing that as Games Workshop has literally evolved over the years, there are different systems and there are different expressions in the fantasy universe and the 40K universe. And some could argue, based on what they support, maybe even a better experience. So Oldhammer is a community that actively looks to play these games with the miniatures, the narrative, and the feeling at the time, but perhaps also using new models or custom or non-Games Workshop models. Okay, great example of Oldhammer. Mordheim. This is a Warhammer Fantasy spin-off. It was a boxed game. It was a specialist game. The idea was you had a warband that went into a city, a cursed city. It's not the cursed city, but went to a cursed city to recover Weirdstone. So the comet of Sigmar, crashed into the city, destroyed it, spread this magical radioactive warpstone, Weirdstone throughout the city, and various warbands are going in because the Weirdstone is used for alchemical experiments. It extends life. It's worth a lot of gold. Nobles want it. Wizards want it. So you can play the various factions in the Warhammer Fantasy universe and go in. Essentially, it's Warhammer Fantasy skirmish. You make some terrain and you move around. I loved the game. I played the game regularly. Games Workshop dropped it immediately. They don't support it. For a while, they sold the miniatures on their site, and when you make a warband, you don't have to use those miniatures. You can use other GW miniatures, or at this point, because it's not supported, any type of miniatures. But the rule set is kind of very, very interesting to play. So in terms of Oldhammer, I have a number of warbands. I've got a fantastic table of terrain. 2 or 3 times a year, I get together with some friends, and that's enough. Look, I'd like to play every game that I have every week, but 2 or 3 times a year is enough. We play a weekend of Mordheim, kind of like a campaign, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 games, very, very fast, winner takes all, and we have a lot of fun playing it from that perspective. So there are elements of the game and the game systems in the past with Games Workshop that people play. And there are communities out there, the Oldhammer communities out there, that you'd be surprised. The game systems are far from dead, despite what Games Workshop would like you to think. Now, on their logistics side, Games Workshop being a toy company and wanting to sell miniatures, there's no money in the Oldhammer systems. And what we see with a lot of the Oldhammer systems is once you purchase your miniatures, you're good. So once I create my warband for Mordheim, at the time, if we look, Games Workshop, I bought the box set, I bought some of the warband miniatures. I built up the miniature warband, so if I have 10 miniatures, I build them up to 15 or 20 to have some variants or have some different configurations. I'm done. GW has sold me 20 miniatures. I'm done. Where they're like, well, we've got to sell this guy another 100 Space Marines. We got to do like 100 Space Marines a year, 10 tanks a year. So they're artificially, by supporting a lot of these Oldhammer systems throughout the day, they realized very, very quick that the cash flow is not there. They experimented with stuff like Titanicus and Epic, where let's sell it really, really expensive. Let's make it really, really expensive. But even with that, fanatics in the system buy it, have it, play it, love it, and they're like, hey, the money is well spent. It's worth it, but there's nothing more to buy. The current Games Workshop model, so Oldhammer there was no profit in Oldhammer. Now what Games Workshop supports with their miniature systems and their toy systems is constant buying, constant buying, constant buying. There's also the idea that there are numerous Oldhammer models that I think had a lot of charm, and I love them, but some of them were products of the time and good for the time. You can't argue that the current kits, if we're talking like Fantasy Age of Sigmar, they look amazing. Current 40K kits, the new ones, look absolutely amazing. So Games Workshop is constantly updating the visuals of their armies, and in that regard, supporting Oldhammer, older systems, older models, doesn't quite make sense. Now, there is that sliver. There is that sliver. Occasionally, Games Workshop, we saw this with various Imperial Guard regiments, where they will limited release. They did this with Sisters a while back. They will do a limited release. I mean, maybe they just crank out the model press and print a bunch of these as a quick cash boost, or obviously they're making profit. They're not doing it because you wanted to collect Iron Guard or you wanted to finally do a Sisters army back in the day. They're doing it because they are making tons of money. They're also possibly doing it to hold on to the IP because they need to actively produce to be able to claim and defend. So there's that angle too. But every now and then you will see them kind of reissue something. But for the most part, it's going to be new stuff. And that's what they're going to support. So by some chance, if you're playing that Oldhammer game, the Oldhammer community, what system do you play? What system do you explore? For myself, I do have a Warhammer fantasy army, an all-goblin army. What was hilarious is the army, all goblins, wolf riders, doom divers, squig hoppers, netters, fanatics, hundreds and hundreds of goblins. Fortunately, they were relatively easy to paint. But from that perspective, I knew what I was getting into with that army. For the lulls, I would set the army up, and like animosity rolls would shut down half the army per turn. But that didn't matter because I had so many goblins on the table. It was just absolutely insane. There was no maneuvering. It's just I had one end of the table to the other, just blocks of infantry and moving forward, and just absolutely crazy. I have that army. I don't play Warhammer Fantasy anymore. No one around here plays it. I'm also in the process of maybe saying, hey, how do I convert this army to Age of Sigmar, or what do I do with that? I play Mordheim regularly a couple of times a year, and I do have a couple of Blood Bowl armies, and I've got a nice Blood Bowl set modeled up, a pitch, a field. We play it a couple of times a year when I just get that random text, you up for Blood Bowl this Tuesday? And it's like, yeah, let's have some fun because it's a fun game. It's a really, really fun game. But in terms of the Oldhammer perspective, that's what I play. Now, side question. Warhammer Quest. Do you consider that Oldhammer, or is that a completely, absolutely different system?